So it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Amy Donovan today, whom I've known for many years. She's a lecturer in geography and environmental hazards at two places. I'm not sure how that is, but it's at King's College in London and the geography department in Cambridge. So well done. You're doing two jobs by the sound of it. And she's a fellow of Girton College here. She works particularly on the interaction between science and culture in hazardous environments, and particularly on volcanoes, which is where I've come across her because we both share an interest in Icelandic volcanoes. She was also a founder member, and she's secretary of the UK Alliance for Disaster Research. So clearly there are, as well as the academic side, there's very obvious social implications of this work for the good of humankind. So she's going to talk to us today about the experience of Christians on Montserrat, which is a little island, I'm sure she's going to tell us where, which has been erupting for many years now. So over to you, Amy.
Thank you, and thank you for sticking with us all the way to the end of the day. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of this research with you. It's partly come out of my own Christian faith, so the reason for doing it was largely curiosity after doing a PhD on Montserrat, around the experience of Christians particularly, because many of the people who've researched Montserrat have not been Christians and therefore have not asked those questions. So those researchers, you go in with a worldview, but you don't necessarily realise that you've got a worldview, especially Western researchers often don't realise the impact of their own assumptions on the work that they're doing. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about the very broad context, so the kind of context that I work in as part of the UK Alliance for Disaster Research, but also really as being motivated by wanting to try to help the situation we've been talking about all weekend around the particular drivers of disaster risk. So I'm going to talk a bit about social studies of disaster, but also about the UN structure, what the UN thinks about disasters. And then I'll give you a bit of background on Montserrat, which could go on for hours, and I will try to keep it short. And then I will go through some of the quotations really from interviews and from a survey that I did on Montserrat. And I really want the Montserratians to be able to speak. So there will be a lot of quotations, and I'm going to try and draw out some of the themes in those quotations. So this is just an infographic. It's like all of the UN ones. It's useless displaying anywhere where anybody can't immediately look right up close at it. But it's from the Global Assessment of Risk report, which is something that gets put together every few years. This is from 2015. And it just gives you the basic facts and figures around disasters in terms of damage, affected people, and then killed people, and particular events. So this is the Haitian earthquake. And you can see that the events that kill people are not necessarily the same that cost lots of money. They're not necessarily the same ones that affect lots of people. So this is a drought that didn't kill people, didn't cost a lot, but had huge impact socially. And again, so this is this earthquake here. This is the Japanese Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. Huge cost, relatively few killed. And again, if you compare that to, say, the 2004 earthquake in Sumatra, you get very different kinds of pictures when you compare these events, even though they're very, very similar physically, depending on where they occur in the world. So one of the things that is really emphasized when we look at the evidence from epidemiological studies of disaster is that these things have a lot to do with social factors, and we've been talking about this all weekend, but the social science of disaster research emphasizes vulnerability. It's the vulnerability of populations that drives disaster risk. And the UN International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, when they explain on their website, the scale of the impact in turn depends on the choices we make for our lives and for our environment. So disasters have to do with governance, particularly, but also with local level decisions, with individual decisions sometimes. And it says that, each decision and action makes us more vulnerable to disasters or more resilient to them. So where you decide to live, how you decide to build your house, if you have control over that, the kind of government system and the kinds of freedoms that it allows, all of these things have big impacts. And this graph, again from the Global Assessment of Risk 2015, emphasises the point that development is a huge driver of disaster risk. So this shows income group, and then the number of life years lost. So that's the number of years that somebody would have lived. So if kids are killed, it counts for more than if the elderly are killed. This is low-income countries, lower middle, upper middle income countries. So all of these are the developing world, as we might think of it. And then the developed world, tiny, tiny fraction of the whole. And that tells you a very important fact, that development is fundamentally a key driver of disaster risk. And as part of that, it's governance and policy, it's how buildings are constructed, but it's also policies that, say, marginalise particular groups, that concentrate wealth in a small fraction of the population. And related to that, so socioeconomic conditions, particularly poverty. The poor, as we've heard throughout the day, are hugely disproportionately affected in disasters wherever they occur. And then there are these issues around education, access to healthcare, and how quickly you can mobilise emergency services, but also whether people know what to do, whether they have the kind of what we would call social capital to look after themselves. And just to give you a sense of the sort of issues that we still have, so there's been this very strong narrative, we know a lot about disasters, there's a lot we can do, we can monitor volcanoes, we can monitor fault lines and give you a few seconds of warning between the earthquake occurring and the seismic waves hitting. We can monitor the weather, all of these things, and yet the life years lost in disasters are continuing to increase. And that's partly because of a sort of an increase in some of the hydrometeorological events. So the dark blue line is hydrometeorological, but the light blue line is earthquakes and volcanoes, tsunami, those kinds of things. And again, it has to do with how you build, how you respond, all of the things that we can do that we now know how to do, but quite often don't do. One of the reasons why the Indian Ocean tsunami was so much worse than the one that happened in Japan was partly it was to do with engineering of buildings. The buildings in Japan are built to shake. But also it was to do with there's a tsunami warning system in the Pacific Ocean. There could very easily have been one in the Indian Ocean, but there wasn't because the United States isn't attached to the Indian Ocean. And the Indian Ocean is surrounded by the developing world, where the priorities are different. If you've got people who aren't accessing healthcare on a daily basis, you might have bigger problems than the one in X years event, 100 years, 1,000 years events, which these things generally are. So there's also this inequality of risk that occurs because of the ability of states to take action. And increasingly we're seeing a narrative of the developed world having a moral obligation to help the developing world. So scientific projects increasingly being encouraged to work in the developing world to try to support the developing world and to transfer some of that expertise. And again, you can't see this very well, but this is another kind of quite good summary diagram from the Global Assessment of Risk. Looks at global processes, so uneven development, rising social economic inequality. We saw the passage in 2 Corinthians 8 this morning that the goal is equality, but that's one of the huge problems. And also collapsing planetary systems and climate change, so hazards. But you also have underlying risk drivers, increasing exposure of populations. So somewhere like the East African Rift Valley, where development is happening at an incredibly rapid rate, Indonesia, China, India, the BRIC countries, where development is happening very, very rapidly without risk-sensitive planning. And people are exposed to hazards in a way that has never been the case in history. There's also issues with lack of accountability, bad planning in urban development, and urbanisation particularly, where you've got people moving into the cities in a lot of these developing nations, which concentrates the risk in an area that is often more difficult to manage because you've got a very tight concentration of people and your infrastructure isn't necessarily ready for that. Even if you look around Cambridge, the infrastructure isn't really ready for cars. So, you know, there's a lot of things that sort of happen very rapidly, and getting people out of a lot of urban areas is very challenging. We've also got vulnerable rural livelihoods, because as industry changes, people get poorer outside of towns. Business and money-making gets concentrated inside the cities. Declining ecosystems, so that's something I'll come back to in a minute, and weak social protection, responsibility of governments, corruption, all of these kinds of things. And that leads to this sort of risk-poverty nexus. You've got multidimensional poverty, you've got intensive and extensive risks. So you've got the idea that some disasters like the tsunamis, big earthquakes, big tsunamis, are really quite, they're the infrequent high impact risks, but you've also increasingly got very frequent, relatively low intensity risks, small scale floods, droughts, that sort of just increase the stress on a population. And all of those things come together and collide, and that causes an acute situation where you've got lots of sort of small scale things that come together. So this is something that is of increasing interest in disaster studies. And of course, you've got everyday risks. You've got crime, you've got food security, you've got disease, pollution, accidents, and of course, the lack of sanitation and clean water issues. So all of these things feed into the disaster risk, and it's very difficult to consider disaster risk separately from the very many factors that make it up. And this is just to illustrate the scale of the problem, really. This is one of those distorted maps from World Mapper. And this shows global wealth distribution. So looking at where wealth is concentrated. You've got Japan, you've got Europe, and you've got the North America. And Africa is almost invisible. Large parts of Asia as well. And this is what really drives disaster risk. It's the inequality of wealth. It's not that we don't have the resources to deal with these situations. It's that they are poorly distributed. And this is getting worse. The inequality of wealth globally is increasing rather than decreasing. Another kind of inequality that relates to all of this, relates particularly to ecosystems and ecological resilience, is the contrast between how much we consume and the bioresource that we have, so the environmental resource, whether that's water, whether it's food and agricultural systems. So the grey countries are ones where their ecological footprint, so how much they consume the natural system, exceeds the capacity that the natural system holds. And again, you can see that the countries that are grey are Europe, the US, and some of the Central American countries, China and India, consuming very rapidly. But once again, you've got the greener countries where they have the biocapacity, they have all of these resources, and they're not consuming them. And these kind of patterns get entrenched and increase. So there's some of the key issues that have been identified in some of the recent work. And you can find the Global Assessment of Risk report on ReliefWeb, which is the UNISDR's portal, which has all of these figures. So if you want to have a look at what they actually say, you can. So issues around inequality that I've talked about, but inequality of risk as well, corruption, which we've mentioned a number of times, segregated urban development, where you've got a rich core of a city, but you've got vast areas of informal housing, many of which have been built in floodplains, on unstable slopes, in places where you really, really don't want to be building. You've got weak regulation, which feeds into that. Nobody cares where people build if they're poor. You've also got overconsumption, poor stewardship, so very poor use of what God has given us, and a lack of accountability. And all of that kind of comes up into poor governance and poor development. So there's a lot of work that's been done to try to think about how we address some of these issues at a kind of a global scale. And we run again and again, we run into problems of the human heart, essentially, that governments, the people running governments come down to individuals, and individuals often just don't act. the people who have the power to act don't act. We can also work with communities, so a lot of DRR works with communities to try to empower them not only to take action, but also to actually advocate for themselves, to form community grassroots groups, to try to put pressure on governments. But I just want to give a quick example of that. So this is a project that I'm working on at the moment in India, which is looking at landslide risk. And it's dominantly a natural science project. It's designing an early warning system. But if you look at some of these developments, these are around Darjeeling. This is Darjeeling town. It's got the Himalayas, stunningly beautiful place. But all of these little areas here are where people who can't afford to live on top of the ridges are building underneath the towns. We know those slopes are unstable because they've been assessed. The Geological Survey of India has assessed them. But the politicians don't want to act, and there are very powerful industrial lobbies. It's where the money is. It's the people in the construction agencies, for example, who want to be able to keep building because it's what their livelihood is. And the government will give in to them because they've got money. And we see this everywhere, all the continents that I've worked on. Latin America, we see, in Latin America, in Argentina, the local governments tried to cover up a volcanic eruption so the skiers would still come. So this motivation to kind of reduce the agency that disaster risk has in the way it's perceived is very, very strong because of a financial gain. And it does come down to this sort of the human condition, essentially. Disaster risk reduction works with national governments, works with local governments to try to improve development practice to reduce risk. We're never going to eliminate risk, particularly from hazards like earthquakes and volcanoes, the really big ones. I mean, volcanoes are going to dump a load of rock on top of your house, and if you're in it, that's a problem. So we can't reduce the risk to zero, but we can take quite a lot of action to reduce it to manageable levels. There are issues with disaster risk reduction. One of the big issues is that it's not very sensitive often to culture. It doesn't necessarily take into account the fact that people are different and believe different things and have different traditions. And it sometimes also kind of gains this, what I find quite interesting, this kind of sense that we can reduce risk to zero because we're human and humanity is at the top of the pecking order. You know, we have infinite capacity to save ourselves. So it can flip round and become a sort of idolatry of the human as well. So there's a sort of a balancing act there. But the key challenges in sort of trying to reduce risk are actually finding ways to impact policy in particular places and understanding the sort of community level, social cohesion, social capital that means that some societies cope a lot better with disasters than others do. And there's huge evidence for that across the world. So understanding culture is one of the kind of key things behind some of the evolving research that we're doing in disaster risk at the moment, but also negotiating scales, understanding local, national scales, and how you actually move from the local to impact on the national, because that's the really big challenge. So there's a lot of kind of interesting things that are going on, lots of big projects at the moment that are trying to have impact across the world to try to reduce risk. The challenge really is understanding context and understanding positionality, I think. And what I'm going to do now is talk particularly, so zoom right in on a very small scale context, to look at how one particular community dealt with what was a fairly substantial crisis for that community. So this is Montserrat, which you can't see on here because it's actually really quite small. You kind of have a trade-off between showing the region or showing the island. So Haiti is up here, Florida up there, and you've got the little Caribbean islands here. And Montserrat is just here, right next to Antigua and Barbuda. This is the island. This is a 4-kilometre scale, so it's about sort of 15 or so kilometres by about 7. So it's tiny. It's really, really small. Since the volcano started erupting in 1995, they have basically been able to use this bit reliably, this bit some of the time, and this bit not at all. So 2/3 of that very tiny island are still off limits. The volcano hasn't actually erupted any rock, any lava, since 2010, but the amount of gas that is coming out of the thing means that you really don't want to spend any time down here. The capital city before the eruption was here. So this is where Plymouth was. Plymouth has been pretty much completely destroyed by the eruption. And Plymouth was the place to be. It was town. It was where everybody wanted to hang out. So the eruption started in 95 and continued episodically, and nobody really thought at the start of the eruption, this is going to last. For years, people thought it'll be like most volcanic eruptions, they're over in a couple of weeks, maybe a month or a few months, but in general, a lot of volcanic eruptions don't last for this length of time. In 1995, the population was getting on for 13,000. During the eruption, over 2/3 of that population left. So they went to America, they went to the UK. The British government, after an awful lot of wrangling, gave them money to go to the UK and claim benefits. And this is because Montserrat is a UK colony. We don't call them that anymore, we call them overseas territories, but it means that the British government is responsible for what happens on Montserrat. There is a governor who is appointed by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, is usually a senior diplomat, and then there's a very small elected government which has control over things like education and housing, while the governor has control over internal security, police, and foreign policy. So there's a split governance. And that kind of early period was really tumultuous because the volcano was absolutely terrifying at that period. The largest eruptions took place in 97, so it took a couple of years to build up to its maximum activity, also very unusual in volcanoes. And there were kind of constant sort of evacuations moving back, So some people were evacuated 14 to 20 times during that early period. There was one time in 1995 where they were evacuated, then a hurricane came, and the British government had put them in tents in the north of the island. So because the risk from the hurricane was deemed to be greater, they were all sent back into Plymouth because it was safer for the few days when the hurricane passed over. So the British government totally knew what it was doing in this situation. And it took a long time to actually figure out how to deal with a volcanic crisis in an overseas territory, even though there was one in Tristan da Cunha in the 50s. So, and again, we've seen that this year with Hurricane Irma in the Caribbean. The British government acting like this has never happened before. When it happened in 1989 with Hurricane Hugo in Montserrat, it happened with the volcano for many years. So there is this kind of constant inability to learn. And I will not rant any more about the British government, but I can do at length in the questions if anybody's interested. And it's sort of a background theme all the way through, because you can't really get away from it. And the eruption also had these hiatuses. So in 1998, in March, it stopped. Everybody thought it was over. And then it started up again in November in 1999. And that was a huge blow. They thought it was over. They thought they could get their lives back. They thought they got through it. And then it started up, and that was when a lot of people gave up and left. And after that, they started having to get from this idea of an acute crisis to something that was chronic, that was actually going to last. They wouldn't be able to go back into their homes. They wouldn't be able to go back, probably in their lifetimes. So Montserrat is really quite surprisingly Christian in lots of respects. It's the only place I've ever been where every meeting you have starts with a prayer. Every day the radio starts with a prayer. There's gospel music on the radio all the time. And the main organising structure in society is the churches. It's the kind of, it had prior to the eruption become very denominational. Whether you were an Anglican or a Catholic or a Methodist or one of the many others was part of your fundamental identity. But during the eruption, because Plymouth was destroyed, because an awful lot of people were homeless, and the churches were also destroyed in the south, The churches in the north were used as shelters because there were no shelters. And that meant that churches sort of started to work together, the congregations got together, worked together, got to know each other. It was also a really, really horrible time, because if you think about your church building, if you go to church, would you really want to live in that for several years? Maybe got a couple of toilets. You've got 200 of you living in there, especially if you're elderly, or if you're ill, or if you've got small children. It's not something you want to sustain. When I did my first lot of PhD interviews in 2009, there were still people living in shelters in Montserrat, 57 of them. That's nearly 15 years after the eruption started. A lot of people lost homes. A lot of people lost almost all of the stuff that they owned instantly because they had to run. They just had to get out when some of the pyroclastic flows came down off the volcano. It was very challenging to arrange relocation. They have rebuilt some settlements, but there was very little land that could be used for building. It's a tiny island, and quite a lot of it's hilly. And this had a huge impact on social structure, had a huge impact on the elderly particularly, who were often sort of put into a nursing home on the other side of the island with nobody they knew, having been in their own home. And it had a huge impact on children because the schools were closed for long periods of time. The shelter life was really not good for children. They stayed out late. And a lot of people who had the social mobility to leave, who had skills, who were the educated elite, a lot of them left, not all of them, but a lot of the people who were more mobile, particularly if they had young children, left the island. So the demographic changed quite significantly. And people had no privacy, they had nowhere to go. People who were living, if you were in the north, you happened to have a house in the north that, say, had room, normally you'd have your family of 4 or 5 living in it, you'd have 30, 40 people living in it. So this is just to give you a sense of what it looked like before the eruption. So these are some photos from the Island of Montserrat website. It's quite looks quite quaint now because it's quite a long time ago. But these are the Emerald Hills. So Montserrat's sort of nickname is the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean. It was very green. That's supposed to have been given to it by Christopher Columbus. And this is the sort of what happened, basically. This is the church tower in Plymouth before the eruption. By the late 1990s, you got a bit of ash build-up. By 2001, most of the church tower has been buried. And this is that top little bit. By 2003, the entire thing has been buried. So huge amounts of rock and ash came down off this volcano, pyroclastic flows and mud flows, and has obliterated what was central Plymouth. So you can still see there are still houses in the background that have been sort of bombed. They've got big holes in the roofs, they've got big holes in them in general. But the centre of Plymouth has been completely obliterated. And these are just some other photos. So this is the centre of Plymouth in about 2008. I suspect most of this is gone by now. You can see the mud flow tracks. This was a steep-sided, what they call a gut on Montserrat valley, steep-sided valley. These are the mud flow deposits. People live here and here. So this is the edge of the inhabited area. But the mud flows come down here every time it rains. There used to be a bridge, but the bridge has been completely buried by the sediments. So if you want to get across to your house up here, you have to drive across the valley floor. You don't want to do that when it's raining, because the mud flows will come and hit you, and they've had a number of near misses as a result of that. Mud flows will happen at active volcanoes a long time after eruptions finish. And these are just another this is the old airport, which is now completely buried as well. Couple of this is the old airport in 2009. This is the old airport when I went there the next year. It has been completely buried now. There was a very large dome collapse event in February 2010 that just completely finished it off. And again, this shows you the same area. So this is a sugar mill. You can't really see it very well, but there's the top of the sugar mill peering out of the deposit. And all of this here, this is new land. So Montserrat has grown, as a result of the eruption. They have more land than they used to, they just can't use most of it. And again, this just gives you the overview of that. So 2007 and then 2010, you can see there's quite a substantial area of new land on the east coast. The grey areas are the ash, so the emerald, what was red in this vegetation is now andesite, it's now rock. It's barren. So the work that I did in Montserrat was based on sort of interviews, survey work, and ethnographic work during my PhD. And then I went back and I did some interviews in 2011 with some church leaders particularly and some local residents. And I'm just, this is one of the quotations from my PhD. She's basically 14 years ago, if anyone had told us it'd be better to build our houses over here in the north, we'd have said, you've got to be joking. Even when the report came out, so there was a report in the 80s that said the volcano might erupt, essentially, about a 1% chance each year, which is quite high for volcanoes. But even if each of us had heard that and had read it, which they didn't because it was in science speak, I'd still, even if they said to you the volcano might erupt, I'd say, well, yeah, it might, but after I'm dead and gone. So this is the kind of the low probability, high impact problem that we have. And during the eruptions, they experienced something that very few people have experienced, really. And this photo, this wasn't really fresh ash, this was just a minor ashing episode. This was around midday and it got pretty much dark. And these are a couple of quotations from some of the interviewees. You didn't know what was happening, that was frightening. You're scared to go to sleep because you don't know if you've got to get up and run. People were sleeping in their clothes in case they had to run. They was always telling you, keep your car filled with gas. It was exciting in some ways and frightening in others. So there's a very strong kind of experience aspect to living through a volcanic crisis, that you see nature in a way that you've never seen it before. Many of my interviewees had to move, so it was a big challenge moving back and forth, having to set up camp again. And they lost a lot in terms of people. A lot of families were split up. The mum and kids would go and the dad would stay, or the extended family would go. So people lost almost their entire social network in the migration to the UK when it was eventually possible to do that. So some families lost their structure where they had control over the children. Living in shelter environments, it's hard to control your child. Shacked up in a shelter was not the ideal thing, and kids were out there being promiscuous. So you had this kind of issue where the children were behaving in ways their parents couldn't control. Like parenting was taken away from them in a sense because of the context they found themselves in. And there was a lot of sort of shifts in the demographic that I've already talked about. Churches had to take place in all kinds of places, so we were worshipping out of each other's homes, we were worshipping out of a clinic, and we had close calls. We were going to church, the volcano erupted, we didn't get halfway to church, it caught us and we couldn't move, we had to stop because we couldn't see in front of us. So I don't have any pictures of the volcanic ash, proper volcanic ash, because there's no point in taking pictures. You can't see anything at all. All they could hear was the screams, the people sort of screaming because they didn't know what was happening, or they did know what was happening, but they didn't know whether somebody was about to drive into them or not. And so you're just sort of hoping that everybody else stops as well. So the big challenges they had were the moving, the constant moving, not knowing where you're going to be, having very few things because you just lose stuff each time you go. You lose everything over time. And this uncertainty about how long it was going to last, which is one of the things that sets volcanic disasters apart in some ways. The hazard didn't go away. The hazard was still there. And nobody knew how long it was going to last. Nobody knew when they were going to be safe from the rocks falling out of the sky. And the kind of the challenges that come from just having that constant anxiety and constant niggling, wondering what you're going to do. So some people were challenged in their faith, but the general impression that I got from talking to people was that many were strengthened, and I'll show the survey results in a minute. One of the residents said, the people whose hearts were hard and cold towards God, their hearts became more that way. And the people who were soft to God became softer. So there was this kind of idea that working through the crisis sort of showed where you were at. Some people made their faith stronger. For others, they had no faith to begin with. Some may have lost hope. The majority of people that I've come across, they've held their faith together. So there's kind of a strong narrative of, a few people struggled with it. Most people were strengthened by it. And we had a lot of people come to work. So people from some of the poorer islands, from Guyana, came to work to clear the ash away. Some came here as Christians, and some became Christians here. So there was also this sense of reaching out to people who came to work. There were people who had to move 3 or 4 times. They lost their homes, lost everything in their homes, they lost their jobs. They were incredibly inconvenienced. And in general, the reaction of those people was, praise God for life. So we heard very much what we heard in the last 2 talks, that there is this kind of refocusing of your priorities onto life as you lose material possessions. These are just some of the survey results, and they very much echo the ones that Roger showed this morning, that God is in control of the volcano. Strongly agree. God is using the volcano to punish Montserrat. That's a bit more ambivalent, but generally disagree. Discipline, again, a bit more ambivalent. God loves Montserrat. Totally completely convinced, apart from one person who strongly disagreed. And these survey samples were also random. They were not selected. One of them had crossed out the entire survey and written, some Amerindian bones were taken off the volcano before the eruption. If you put them back, it'll stop. So there were a range of beliefs, people who took the survey. My faith has helped me to cope, strongly agree. And then this idea of the eruption bringing Montserratians together, I'm going to come back to, because that's, a lot of people said it's brought us closer together, but also they'd had this huge fragmentation of their society. So they were holding these 2 things in tension. And again, these are very sort of similar. I've questioned my faith. I've deepened my faith. Well, the eruption has deepened my faith. Nobody had lost their faith because of the eruption out of the people who took the survey. I'm puzzled about it, so again. But generally, God has blessed Montserrat. And doing a factor analysis on this, the factors that came out were around coping. Faith is helping people to cope. The sovereignty of God, that he's in control. Issues around judgment and trying to work out what God is actually doing in all of this. And then community, so this tension between fracturing and togetherness. And issues of puzzling it out. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And this is just a sort of a conceptual model for thinking about the groups of responses. So when you have qualitative interview data, you code it. And I used a grounded theory approach where you let the data tell you what the themes are. These were the big themes, so sort of being in the world, experiencing this thing and what it did to us. The church, the role of the church, but also the theology behind what was happening. And there were also culture clashes. I'm not going to talk about those. I can talk about them in the questions. That is to do with the role of the UK particularly, so to do with colonial governance, and also to do with science that was coming in from outside and kind of ignoring the fact that they were quite culturally different from some of the scientists. And again, I don't have time to talk about that. And this is how it sort of breaks down, and you'll sort of hopefully notice there's quite a lot of synergies here between what we were talking about this morning. So suffering, issues around suffering and questioning, but around sovereignty, around creation, and around learning to be dependent on God, new priorities. Also the role of the church, so in meeting practical needs, in counselling, in losing together, so shared loss, and in breaking barriers and reforming communities. And the thing I'm going to talk about first is the being in the world, so I'm going to kind of sort of zoom closer and closer in and end with the theology. So the restructuring of society, the things that were happening around you, dealing with the changes in your material wealth, the structure, the sort of togetherness and separation issue, and some of the opportunities in society. So the eruption led to this major social restructuring. A lot of the interviewees were like, We don't blame them for leaving, really. Initially, we thought they were cowards, but now we've come to think that actually they did what was best at the time for them. A lot of them had young children. It wasn't an ideal place to be when the ash had fallen. Kids were getting sick. They were in and out of school. It was very disruptive. We had this rise in teenage pregnancies as a result of kids staying out late at night, not having anywhere to go because they didn't have homes, so they were staying out as late as possible to avoid going into the shelters because it's not a nice place to be. So then the church changes its role in trying to offer support for the young mothers. So there's these kinds of give and takes that were going on between how society was being restructured around them and how they were responding to that. The farmers, again, so many of them struggled because they would have been in their farms, and they struggled with that from a different lifestyle. We have fewer opportunities in a livelihood sense, and some of the churches also responded to that. There was also this issue of sort of everybody being in it together. You know, volcanoes don't treat people, in the fundamental sense, they don't treat people differently, whether they're rich or poor or whatever. They're still going to drop rocks on you. And on an island like Montserrat, this is the entire nation, really. So everybody was being affected by this crisis. Nobody's gotten out of it. No church has gotten out of it. And it served to bring the body of Christ together, because basically everybody was sweeping up ash all of the time. And even if you spend time on Montserrat now, you spend a lot of time sweeping up ash because it just gets remobilised every time the wind blows, which is all the time. So you go back to your house at the end of the day and it looks like you've left it for 100 years and you've got enough dust for 100 years. So it continues to be this kind of thing that everybody has to deal with. Some people felt more togetherness before the volcano, and some of that's to do with breaking down of old social networks, to do with the breaking down of families. But there's also the idea that everybody's going through the same pain, they're suffering the same fate, and in times of crisis people do cling together. So there was these two processes happening at the same time. Possessions is something that came up a lot. And there's two aspects to this. There's the moving away from depending on material things. So since Hurricane Hugo, which is in 1989, I don't hold on tightly to material things. It is important as having nice things are. There's nothing like having a personal faith and confidence in God that you can go to bed at night and rest comfortable. But then also the effect of this, particularly on young people, came up in several interviews that people, because young people were they didn't get the same level of, they weren't cared for in the same way because they couldn't be in that environment. They became quite selfish, or they became quite clingy around food, but also around, cell phones and things like that. They started to experience some thefts and things like that. And this was quite a small scale. This came out in a few interviews, but not very many. And there was this sense of inequality in terms of how much people got out of the eruptions. That some people were taken care of and some people weren't. So there's again this sort of two-way sense, but particularly around that the young people grew up with a distorted sense of material possessions, whereas the people who went through it as adults tended to feel, actually, we don't need material possessions. We can relinquish them. I quite like this one as well. People can't use the telephone, so they're writing notes to each other. So there's a sense in which community is enriched in spite of the things we thought were enriching, like mobile phones. We used to think those were things that were enriching. But actually, writing notes to each other enriched us more than Facebooking each other, or whatever it is. Sometimes I say, God bless the volcano, because some of us get more out of the volcano than what we had as well. So some people were actually able to get houses when they couldn't afterwards. But again, there was a lot of give and take on that. And then opportunities. So opportunities for the church to get to know people, to reach out to new groups of people. The perfect opportunity for the place to become humbled. That came up a lot, the sense of being dependent. And I'll come back to that a bit later on. And the opportunity to go out and get education. So when the British government finally decided that it might actually have to do something, they did waive university fees for Montserratians to get education in the UK. So people got tertiary education that they wouldn't necessarily have had. And also there was a lot of creativity around the eruption, people writing poetry. Montserrat was very strongly sort of artistic prior to the eruptions. It was the home of Air Studios, George Martin's Air Studios. There were lots of very famous artists who used to go and record there, but there were also was also a very strong poetic group. And that there is this sense that disasters can sometimes bring out that side to life. So moving on to the specific sort of role of the church, and again, this business of people suffering together and believing together and staying faithful together came up again and again. So building up, the role of the church is to build up the faith of the people. If their relationship to God and with each other is healthy, come volcanoes or come hurricanes or come peace and tranquility, that's a solid foundation. So there was a lot of emphasis on we need to encourage them in their faith so that they can cope. There was also the role of the church in providing for these new needs. So I've already talked a little bit about the mothers trying to also provide new income earning opportunities, teaching people skills so that the disaster is not really a disaster but an opportunity. So very conscious trying to turn it round within the church context. And bringing the churches themselves closer together. So a lot of the churches were shelters. And people were accepted into any church, whether it was their church or not. So it broke down some of these really sort of fake denominational barriers that had formed prior to the eruption. They also, because they were being shelters, it sort of, because they were in churches, I think it started making people a bit more serious about prayer and about sort of thinking through this in the context of their faith. There's also this issue I mentioned with the farmers before. Farmers were relocating from the east. The east was one of the most dangerous bits. And they needed a livelihood, and we identified some land. So we were getting loads of food supplies, and that went to the Christian Council, and then people realized that the Christian Council was for everybody. It was open, so the Christian community became much less barriered up. And then also this sort of openness issue, which I think has come up a few times today as well, that how this eruption affected people was to some extent to do with how open they were to being used, and how open they were to having God teach them things about themselves. So, people were able to, without being pushed, to see evidence of God's activity among us. It was their own theology, although they didn't call it theology. So this working through of questions and issues. And this is something that Joanne Mead writes about in her PhD thesis. She talks about talking it out. She talks about the importance of trying to think really explicitly about the theological questions that these kinds of events will raise, that people will wonder, is God punishing me? And you saw from the survey results, there's a bit of ambiguity around this. People were still a bit, is it discipline? Is it judgment? Is it Montserrat sins? This continued again and again, and comes up again and again. So people needed a space to talk about those kinds of things. And the role of the pastor was really in listening to the theology that came from persons and recognizing it was basically their own theological reflections that were then singularly instrumental in helping them to cope as they work through it. So it's not like a simple, quick fix, that there's an easy explanation for these things. It was that people had to work it through. And the church had its role to play in just being there, the hope, the courage, and the strength. And this is one of my favourite quotations. There were some times when you had to get into the depths and to demonstrate to them the importance of lifting up their eyes to the same hills, which appear to be on fire, to a God who says, I would never leave you or forsake you. So people's faith was strengthened. They saw the manifestation of Almighty God, as well as that beside the frustration and the pain, they were able to enjoy some good days, trusting God for his blessing and his favour. So people, through experience, through the sort of process of living through this thing that was destroying them, watching their, lifting their eyes to the hills that are on fire, actually refining them in the process. And linked to that is this sense of loss and grief and sadness. Getting through the inevitable sadness, that this place where you grew up, where you cultivated the land, where you lived all of your life in a small community that's very close-knit, you're never going back there. And because you had to leave with the clothes on your back all the time, it's a forced situation, and therefore closure was not achieved. There's a long grieving process. for those kinds of losses, even as you accept them. You know, it takes a long time to get over this kind of thing. They also did lose people. So in 25th of June, 1997, 19 people were killed. They were all in an area they weren't supposed to be in, but they were tending their farms. There were also people who went missing and who haven't been accounted for, who were potentially sort of had special needs and weren't able to take care of themselves, weren't able to get out. And people have noticed that they're missing. And again, this hasn't been officially recorded, but it's what a lot of people will tell you. So they lost people they knew. It's quite a close, you know, everybody knows pretty much everybody else. And it's quite difficult to get through that, even though, you know, the governor and the chief scientist had gone to these people and said, please leave now, the volcano is going to come get you. And they were chased off with machetes. So, you know, people really weren't going to leave the land. But they died, and it's known as 25 on the island. And that is something that continues to be a significant memorial event every year. But what do you tell someone who's lost all their possessions, and some of them elderly people, and they have to start over? And this issue of the elderly came up again and again. So this is somebody who was relating a friend who's probably got Alzheimer's because she used to have a nice house in Plymouth. Her family was intact, and then she had to go and live somewhere with somebody else because her family had left, and she's not the same. And that, you see those kinds of narratives a lot, that's particularly the elderly really struggle to cope. And there was somebody else who said, every so often we do a funeral, and I hear somebody say, I didn't even know that person was still alive, because the community's been fractured so much. And even though it's a very small line, it's very hippie, and you don't necessarily see people that often, especially because they've all been moved around and they're all going to different churches and they're all not in their same social network anymore. And again, coming back to this sort of heart-wrenching situation, to know that you might never go back to that social community, to that collection of friends and people who lived together, grew up together. You might never get to go back to that. It carries with it some sad memories, but at the same time you give God thanks to be alive and to be able to move on with your life. And then issues around breaking barriers. So this is really the denominational things that people were very strongly in those denominational camps prior to the eruption, and it broke down some of those things. Early on, it was very much about bonding and sort of getting to know people, but it became very inconvenient after, you know, a fairly short period of time. You know, a couple of weeks, you can cope with this sort of situation. 15 years, it's a bit tedious. And once the evacuations to England started, particularly around 97 when the volcanic activity was at its highest, and a lot of people left, all your family and friends left, and you felt that vacuum within you. So really a very strong sense of loss. And then having to adjust to new communities, adjusting to new church groupings, the way they think and the way they do things that are slightly different from how we used to do things. And that pushes your kind of comfort zone all of the time. You're discovering these things about you that were comfortable and that you hadn't even realised you'd got comfortable with, but that you're pushing against because you're suddenly in a new community. But it broke down the barriers. People got to know each other in a different way. So this kind of reframing. And then one of the things that people talked about a lot was the different scriptures that helped them. And one of the ones that came up a lot was Psalm 46. So they linked this idea of God as strength and refuge, ever-present help in trouble. There's a number of sort of references here that are sort of semi-volcanic, so mountains falling into the heart of the sea, which Santorini in Greece did about 1600 BC, I think. Mountains quaking with their surging. And again, he lifts his voice, the earth melts. So there's a number of references that, seeing the volcanic context, you can kind of resonate with, but very much taking away that God is where we flee to in our heart when these things happen. And this came up a number of times, Psalm 46. And then some of these kinds of fantastic theological reasonings that people had gone through this period, particularly around what they were seeing happen before their eyes. So people give God thanks that they have been able to see our mountain grow. They feel a strong sense of pride to be able to experience something many people in the world will never experience in their lifetime. So in some ways, you're able to understand the awesomeness and majesty of Almighty God in terms of his creative genius. So actually seeing creation happening and seeing that as a privilege, and seeing the wonders of all these horrible things coming down that would kill you if you got close to it, but that are also utterly spectacular. The lava on the dome at night and all of these kinds of things. One of the pastors said, "We came onto an island that God hadn't finished building yet. We inhabited it before it was built, and these things are natural. It's normal. This is how creation happens." And they sort of also talked about, it's creation in action, fortunately or unfortunately, and it's interesting they say both. These have adverse effects on people. Some of those adverse effects, actually, they would now say were not that adverse, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But I do believe that life was meant to be difficult. Not that it should be oppressive, but I think if we had life smooth, we'd never reach our human potential. Insofar as we ever reach it, was how she went on. So she didn't say we're at the pinnacle now, because she was very humble about it. But, there's this kind of sense that some of these trials in life we shouldn't try to get out of, actually. And all of the people I really spoke to who were Christians said, God was in control and we are blessed. God has had his hand on this country in one way or another, despite the fact we can sometimes be insolent people, not be obedient, not listen, even though a lot of us call ourselves Christians and we're not. And I think God has been very lenient with us. So this kind of sense that actually God could have done a lot of things that would squash us, and he didn't. He's in control, and he's teaching us that we might not trust in ourselves. And that was another lesson that came out a lot. I think it was Paul one time that said they might not trust in themselves, but believe in God. These are the things that kind of, the narratives that come out around sovereignty. Suffering and questioning. So we've talked a lot about this already, that there's a lot of questions that people ask around suffering in any context. And some of the pastors that I interviewed particularly, and some of the residents just listed. So Job questioned God. Jeremiah spoke to his circumstances and regretted the very day that he was born. We have references of great men of God who had their own share of turmoil. We can look to Elijah. And after seeing the rules and power of God, they begin to flee and question whether anybody else was serving God apart from them. So there were times when the circumstances and human frailty, the humanness within you creates that kind of situation where you'd question why and seek for answers. But I believe it is in that search for answers that the peace of God comes in and lets you know I'm here with you. And then somebody else, David said he'd never seen the righteous forsaken. So as you work through these things, you see that. It's been tough, but you see God helping you. It hasn't been easy, but you see God building you up, and you praise God you're alive. And it's to realise that these things, so material possessions and so on, and indeed the green hills and all the rest of it, are only for you to enjoy and be comfortable, and they can be taken away from you, but you will always have God. And again, that echoes a lot of the other things that we've heard today. The sense that it's happening for a reason, maybe it's to make us stronger, maybe it's to bring us closer, maybe it's to open our eyes to things and to try to correct them. And again, opening our eyes to inequality, opening our eyes to the things that we don't normally see because we're comfortable. And that sort of leads into this sort of the narratives around refinement, catharsis, and this sort of sense that believers will grow stronger in bad times. As you come to terms with your mortality, it's more urgent to think about what really matters. And because of that, people can make positive changes. There were people who were very much kind of looking to the Old Testament as well as the New Testament, looking at, God's people suffered setbacks, God brought them through. He looks out for his children, his eyes are on us. God knows what he's doing, and if he wanted to wipe us out, he could have. and trying to sort of work through, is God disciplining us? Is he punishing us? Even if there's discipline, we're supposed to come out of it as pure gold. As we go through trials, we come out of it better for the trials. While God may allow us to have things in this life, we have to arm ourselves to go through trials. There's a lot of these kinds of narratives that come out, and I find it very hard to delete any of them. Suffering is intended to bring out the best of you, and that is very clear in the scriptures. So from a theological standpoint, our faith has been strengthened, and they were very proud of the fact, when you walk around Montserrat and you look at the peace and the happiness and the tranquility on people's faces, you must agree with me. And I believe that they are better off today because of this experience that they underwent. And this is another one of my favourite ones. Sometimes when it's hot here, people complain, and I complain, but I don't say, Lord, take this sun away. You've got to be careful what you ask for. So whatever he sends my way, I'm just going to thank him. And again, they'd worked through to get to that. It was a long, long narrative in this case of how they worked through to get to that. And even that kind of back reflection, so the idea that we were strong in bad times, and actually, we tend not to be better in good times. We need the bad times because in good times we just get lazy. So again, this kind of strong theology of needing it. And also this, if he brings you to it, he'll bring you through it, kind of mantra that again, very, very rooted in the scriptures. They did work through this issue of judgment. There were sort of what I would refer to as cults probably that set up a little red tent on the island and basically said, this is because Montserrat is really sinful. It's because Montserrat's sinning more than the other islands. There must be something wrong with you. So people were wondering about that. They were wondering if they were being punished, and they had to work through that. And it's very difficult pastorally, I think, sometimes to communicate that, because there is ambiguity in the Bible that we've talked about already, that there are times when people are punished for sin. There are other times, like in Luke 13, where it appears not to be related directly to their sin, but to the sort of wider world that we live in. So people struggled to try to communicate that among themselves. And then they did come back to Job. Job speaks of the actions of the devil. It's been allowed by God. It was not necessarily God placing judgment on Montserratians. When you look at other islands, or the UK, we're no worse than them. And again, this kind of emphasis that discipline can be a positive thing, but that it wasn't directly related necessarily to stuff they were doing, as opposed to stuff other islands were doing. But, we're humans. We have our doubts as to why this happened sometimes. But because you don't always have a clear-cut answer for some situations, you try to believe or you deny depending on your attitude and your standard of faith and confidence in God. You have questions from time to time, and which way you go will depend on you. 2 Chronicles 7, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will heal their land. And again, this was something that came up a number of times because I did the interviews in 2011, so not that long after the Haitian earthquake, and there's a lot of a lot of people mentioned, a lot of people said, is this, why did they do that? Why did God do that to Haiti? And I know when the earthquake happened in Haiti, the first thing people said was, it's because of voodoo. It's God punishing them for voodoo. But I don't know if that had anything to do with it. I think it was maybe time for that to happen, just like it was time for the volcano to happen here. Things happen for a reason, and sometimes we can't fathom why. Things just happen. And that sort of reminds me a little bit of Ecclesiastes, that there's a time for everything. We don't always understand the reasoning behind those timings. And what a lot of this points towards is learning dependence, the act of learning to depend on God and not ourselves. So I think about David before he was king and being pursued by Saul and hiding in caves. Didn't make any sense to him at all, but it made him desperate for God, and he prayed for God not to take that pressure off him. keep it on him, to keep him desperate for God in future when things are going to be better. And I got that a lot. That narrative of, I don't want to lose this dependence on God that I've got from this process. So he's working them through it, he's bringing them to realize that God's in control and can help them come to a point of dependence. And this is another, so there's a lot of sort of particular stories that, this guy was driving out of the exclusion zone with his tires burnt up, and he was singing Amazing Grace that saved a wretch like me, in a rather more kind of literal sense than we normally sing that song, I guess, or at least a more physical sense. And what I thought about so Montserratians talk about resilience a lot. They're very keen on the idea that they're resilient. Resilience is a word I've used over and over again with Montserratians. It's because of our belief that God is in control. It has shown us that in a twinkling of an eye, all things can be taken away. And so if we're not putting our trust in material things, we're able to shake off and move on. That's the sort of idea of resilience, the idea that you can recover quickly from a shock. It takes great courage and God's faith to start again, to lose everything in a flash, but they're resilient and their faith has helped them start again. So this kind of kept coming out as well. I'd say it was their faith that sustained them. Without faith, I don't think they'd have adjusted or be as resilient as they are, and their faith is a big part of that. So a lot of kind of comments around resilience. I hear people speak of the resilience, but I attribute that to the ever-abiding faith. So it comes up again and again and again. It's faith and resilience and linked in their eyes. So this kind of idea of resilience on Montserrat is sort of constructed out of a range of different things, but shared experience, togetherness that came out of fragmentation, a release from material possessions, a release from depending on material possessions, reordering of priorities as well, the kind of life is what matters more than anything else, and relationship with God in life, so those two things can't be separated. Dependence on God, so I've put sort of deeper relationships horizontally and vertically, and I would include in the horizontal not just with each other but also with the natural environment, with the volcano, the earth processes. The colonial governance was a complete and utter disaster area in a lot of ways. That's one of the reasons there was social fragmentation. If there'd been planning, there wouldn't have been. But a number of people said it was demanding, it was stressful, but having lived through it all, if I had a choice, I would go through it again. I value every moment of it. So it's a shift in values and what they value in experience. And more broadly, this, I think, has some kind of implications really for disaster studies, that faith is something that gets overlooked a lot in disaster studies, partly because people coming at it from a secular background and don't think it's important, even though actually their own secular worldview quite often is very important in how they approach any situation. And faith has a dynamic role in how people cope with disasters because it's a working through process. It's not like you have all the answers when something bad happens, but it is a process of being refined by fire. The Montserratians viewed themselves as resilient as they went through that process. The sort of ideas of lament that we talked about earlier was really important, lamenting, but also doing that together, so having a sense of people struggling with the theology, struggling with the loss of community, loss of life, loss of everything, home as well. Home is different from possessions. Coping with that together. And learning humility, and again that came out a lot, that people had to be humbled. They learned to be humble, that science wasn't going to save them, and this was a big issue in the early part of the eruption, that we live in this technologically advanced world where people do expect more of science than what science can actually do. We can give some vague forecasts and scenarios about what volcanoes might do. Nobody forecast that this thing was going to last 15 years. So there's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot of things that we just can't actually manage in terms of the scientific knowledge, in terms of knowing how our lives are going to work out as well. And that's a whole other kind of knowledge to the sort of techno-scientific. Having said that, a lot of the things that happened, a lot of the really big problems that occurred in the eruptions were entirely avoidable because of governance problems rather than because of the volcano. And everything anybody talks about as being negative really comes down to governance, poor governance. They had a report that said the volcano was going to, was likely or relatively likely to erupt. When they rebuilt after the hurricane in 1989, it was really so they rebuilt the town, they got a really state-of-the-art hospital in Plymouth, which is now in ruins. So all of these kinds of things where, just issues of human responsibility, really, on lots of different people, to try to sort of deal with the knowledge that we have and use it, steward it responsibly, which is a huge challenge because you don't always know where you're, there's a lot of volcanoes erupt every year. There's an awful lot more that don't, and you never know which ones are going to erupt. So when do you even start planning for these things? How do you get it onto government's timescales? Because volcanoes have their own timescales, much longer than a 4-year term of government office. So there's rarely any political capital in investing in them. And I just want to finish with that, because that's one of the little mantras that we hear a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Well, it's been a long afternoon, but we'll have a little bit of time for questions before we have a bit of a break before dinner. So does anybody have anything they'd like to ask or comment?
Amy, thank you for your talk. And I noticed at the beginning you pointed out there was a lot of different traditions that you spoke to. Is your data subtle enough to be able to detect different responses to the disaster in terms of different versions of the Christian tradition?
There are some slightly different things that the data sort of points to, but it's not. I was expecting there to be a lot more difference between, say, Catholic and Protestant particularly, and there wasn't. There was a lot of similar kinds of issues had come up, similar kinds of approaches had come up. A lot of it depended on the pastor of the church, particularly, so what their emphases were, I think, whether they emphasised the need to talk through things or whether they were a bit more kind of around practical helping or these kinds of issues. But there wasn't anything that was strikingly different. There's one or two sort of minor, like the smaller churches that were a little bit different to the mainstream churches, but that's such a fine scale that it's not very easy to say definitively.
This thought just came to me, so it may be pushed. But I was just wondering, have you any way of accessing the people who did leave the island and interview them as to how they felt about things, not just those who stayed?
Yeah, so this was a challenge. There are still some communities of Montessorians in the UK, but they went to lots of different places. So some of them went to Antigua, some of them went to the US, some of them went to the UK, and they started to integrate after a while. So one of the the Montessorians on the island are still trying to hold the whole thing together because they're desperate for the diaspora to go back, and the diaspora's probably not going to go back. I haven't interviewed any of the guys off island, partly because I was interested in the people who stayed and in their narratives and their stories of going through it. It is something I'd like to do, but I think it's getting harder and harder because it's 15 years, more than 15 years, since most of them left. So they really have moved on. And there is stuff in the literature. So there are people who were there who have written about their experiences of just being absolutely terrified of the thing, for example. But there's less overt sort of theological aspect to that. People don't write so much about that, which might reflect the cultures that they are embedded in and whether they're willing to talk about those things in those cultures, I think.
Amy, the issue of the effect of Christianity and faith on a community like that being written out of mainstream, whatever it is there any way around that you can think of? I mean, is there any strategy that can be put in place, things like articles to be written, which, I mean, I can't really think of anything other than that, but it just it happens so much. It happens in this country as well, doesn't it? It just gets completely written out.
Yeah.
So I wondered if you've got any ideas.
I think it's a big challenge that is starting to be realised in disaster risk. So there was a book published a couple of years ago on culture in disasters. So culture being rather broader in lots of senses than belief or worldview, but still starting to get to these sorts of variations that actually, you know, values and cultures are really important. It's not just socioeconomic vulnerability that affect these things. So there is a sort of movement towards it, I think, but I do think there is a sort of an importance to get the evidence out there as well, that these things are important to people. Of course, when people with different worldviews are evaluating that evidence, they will come to different conclusions. So my own, and as a social scientist, you always know that your own interpretation of the data, the kind of data you collect, the way you analyse, all of these things are influenced by you. So everything is subjective. And other people might, you know, they'd ask different questions, they get different data. I don't think actually that somebody who wasn't a Christian would have access to much of this stuff, because I don't think people would be as honest as they were, or at least, not that they'd be dishonest, but that they wouldn't be as open. Quite understandably, because they'd be worried about being judged. So there's a lot of quite complex interpersonal issues in sort of in method around this as well that are kind of difficult to negotiate. It's one of the reasons I haven't written it up, is that I'm not entirely sure what kind of a reception it would get from a reviewer. So, does that matter? No, well, in terms of it actually getting out there, it matters. It's the trouble with social sciences, can be a little bit interesting in that respect.
You mentioned voodoo on here. I want to just see, but the other faiths. Have you looked into the fact that there are other, or are you aware of other disasters like Haiti, or any comparisons of how voodoo has been used?
Not necessarily voodoo.
Okay.
There's other cultures on volcanoes that are sort of indigenous belief systems. So there's a very famous example is Merapi volcano in Indonesia. In Indonesia, they have these shamans who sort of mediate between the Sultan, the volcano, and the sea. And Merapi is persistently active. It's very similar to Montserrat in some ways. It builds domes, but in 2010 it had a slightly larger eruption than it normally has. And the gatekeeper for the rituals that they do on the volcano basically stayed on he was like, I'm staying on the volcano, I need to talk to the volcano. And some of his followers stayed with him, and they all died. And there was a lot of kind of negotiation of that within the culture. And that's something that kind of comes up in volcanoes are slightly different from some of the other hazards in that they often themselves can be associated with belief systems. So we see that all over the world. There's legends around volcanoes, some of them more current than others. So again, you've got an indigenous thing that's even linked in with the earth that can affect how people perceive and deal with what the Western view would say is a risk, but what they might not see as a risk at all. You know, they might see it in a completely different way. And one of the challenges for science, for managing the risk and reducing the risk, is negotiating those belief systems in a sensitive way, rather than just saying, you're wrong, this is to do with plate tectonics, which is the kind of the Western way, unfortunately, quite a lot of the time. You know, just sort of, we're going to stick to the geological narrative and we're not going to try and reach them where they are. And I think some of the Indonesian scientists have managed that quite well from what I know anecdotally, but it's still something that you know, we do encounter, and I'm sure that Luke knows a lot more about voodoo particularly than I do. So the only thing I heard on Montserrat was around Amerindian bones. So, yeah.
Any more comments or questions? I know a bit about working on Hawaii because I've worked there, and certainly indigenous belief systems there are taken very seriously by the Hawaii Volcano Observatory. I mean, to the extent that when there was a lava flow flowing towards a local village, you know, they could have diverted it fairly easily, actually, but the villagers said no. You know, this is what the mountain wants to do, and we'll let it do it. And actually, in fact, in that case, it did stop. I think it buried the cemetery, but it stopped before the houses. But yeah, I think it's an issue that people are only recently becoming aware of, really, is being respectful of local traditions. I think it's been a really long day, and I will draw stumps now. Thank you very much again, Amy.